Great Tool Biologist, Mr. Kleiman here. Today we're going to be talking about osmoregulation. And if you think about the word osmo is rooted in the word osmosis. So this is the homeostasis of maintaining your water and your solute balance in your cells and in your blood. So let's have a look at it. In us, we have a complex organ system that can deal with our water and our solute balance. Not all creatures have such a complicated system, but all creatures need to maintain some kind of homeostasis, in particular of their water. So let's see how we can achieve this. So the first thing I want to do is a quick memory refresher on what is osmosis. And it's just a fancy word for saying the diffusion of water. And like all other materials, water will move from a high concentration to a low concentration, all by itself, no added energy needed. Now in this diagram, there may be the exact same number of water particles on both sides of this semi-permeable membrane, but you'll notice that there's more arrows headed this way than back. So doesn't it seem like this is working against this idea of moving from high to low concentrations, the same amount of water on both sides? But in reality, when we're talking about concentrations, it's really about percentage. What percent of this side is water? Well, it's 100%. What percent water on this side? Well, much less, because we have these big yellow things that represent some kind of a solute. And these red arrows that you see are most likely hydrogen bonds, some kind of an interaction between the water molecule and the solute that's dissolved in it. And so what that ultimately means is that any water particle that makes its way to this side of the semi-permeable membrane is likely to start to interact with the solutes on this side, and therefore it's more likely to stay here. And so there's a lower percentage of water on this side, meaning a lower concentration of water on this side. And so water will tend to go from high to low concentration, osmosis. And of course that has huge implications for cells because of course they're made out of a semi-permeable membrane. And one of the things that it is permeable to is water. And remember, these membranes are not permeable to much. It's almost an impenetrable barrier of molecules. And so any solutes that are inside of your cells are generally pretty trapped there unless we create an ion channel to let them in or out. And so the insides of these cells, whatever things we're producing, whatever solutes are in there, are going to determine where water goes. We don't have control over that. So if we have not a lot of solute in here, and that can be, low levels of ions or even the proteins that we've made, that means that the surrounding area may have more solute than inside, and that's going to draw water out of a cell. If you make a heck of a lot of proteins and absorb a lot of ions and salts, that's going to create a high concentration of solutes inside of the cell. And if it's higher than the outside, water is going to be drawn into this cell. And so that's the nature of this semi-permeable membrane, is that some things can go through like water and other things cannot, like these solutes. And you can see that over time, when we start out with the same amount of water on both sides, water is actually going to work against gravity, making its way to this side, hanging out with the solutes. And so this can create pressure. And so if you think about that in terms of cells, you can see why this is so critically important to keep it in balance. Because if too much water goes in, we build up too much pressure inside of these cells and they can burst. In a plant cell, they've got a cell membrane, and so that internal pressure is going to push up against the cell wall and keep this thing rigid and upright. The ideal situation is this here, where we have about the same amount of water coming in as we have going out. And there's enough turgor pressure to keep this thing relatively upright. Now, in this case, there's not a huge amount of pressure against the cell wall. And so for a plant, they might need more water than you and me. Otherwise, they become what's called flaccid. They'll start to droop, right? Think of a wilting flower. In the last situation here, you can see that there's more solute outside of the cell than inside, and water starts getting drawn out. So this is when you've, let's say, eaten that bag of chips, and now you've got really a high concentration of salt in your blood. That's going to start to draw water out of your cells and into your blood. You're going to get dehydrated from those salty snack foods. And if you're a plant, if you're in salty soil, your cells are going to dry out so much that the cell membrane can actually separate from the cell wall. And this could be the death of that plant. And so there it is, right? Plants use this osmotic gradient to use it like their bones. It's their main structure. And if they're nice and turgid, it's a nice, upright, healthy-looking flower. And if you don't water your flowers, we've all seen this situation before, they're going to wilt. This is everything to do with osmoregulation. So let's look at this situation of fish. And here are two fish that to our eyes look quite similar, but in terms of their physiology, they must be quite different. Because if you look at the environments that they live in, this one is in fresh water, meaning a very low solute concentration. We'd call that a hypotonic solution. And this one is in a marine environment. That's the ocean, salt water. And so it's a hypertonic environment. And so you're going to see the movement of water and ions being actually completely reversed in these two creatures. They need completely different mechanisms to deal with their osmotic balance. And so if we think about firstly the freshwater fish, since the surrounding solution is hypotonic, meaning not a lot of ions and salts compared to their insides, water is going to have a tendency to want to come into them. They don't even need to drink through their mouth. They're going to absorb all the water they need, mostly through their gills and some through their skin. But this is going to create a need to get rid of some of the extra ions, to get rid of that extra water that's coming in. They need to pee, and they're going to produce really, really dilute urine. And what are they doing with their ions? Well, some of them they're going to be actively uptaking through their gills as well for the various nutrients that they need. And others they're going to be diffusing out through their gills. They can get rid of whatever waste products they want quite easily, and some of it can also escape through their skin. And the last bits they can filter out of their blood and let it go out with a huge amount of water through the urine. They're never for loss of water. It's always coming in, whereas a marine fish is in a very different situation. They're in a constant stress to be dried out. Water is diffusing out of their skin and is being drawn out of their gills by the surrounding salty water. And so they need to not only drink some seawater, but they're also going to need to have some internal mechanism to really concentrate their waste and save water, to kind of keep that water in. And ions are going to be in this perpetual state of wanting to get into their bodies from the outside water. So they need to use energy to actively pump these ions out if they want to get rid of waste products. So they can either get rid of some of them through their gills or through their urine-like waste products. Okay, very concentrated urine, very dilute urine. Totally different physiologies. This is one of the reasons why when salmon leave the oceans and head towards their freshwater spawning grounds, their entire physiology needs to change, and by the end of it they're so thoroughly exhausted that that is a one-way trip. They can't change their physiology back again to return to the oceans. And so every creature has its own basic strategy for how to deal with their osmoregulation. And as you just saw, the production of urine can be one of the ways of getting rid of some of your waste products, getting rid of some of your solutes. And so with it can go some water as well. And you're either going to want to concentrate that urine or allow it to be dilute. And so one of the main waste products that's being getting rid of through urine is your nitrogenous waste. So some of your organs are using amino acids as a source of energy, not just building blocks for proteins. And when you do use them for energy, and we break down those amino acids, one of the waste products we produce is the removal of this amino group to produce a really toxic waste product called ammonia, and then we need to get rid of that really quick. Fish have very little problem getting rid of this with huge amounts of water through their dilute urine. Mammals, however, if we try to store ammonia in our bladders, we're going to be in for some serious toxicity, and that's a pretty bad idea. So what we do is we convert this nitrogenous waste into a slightly modified version. We make this molecule called urea. And that's the stuff that makes your pee yellow. A little bit less toxic and can be stored for a little bit longer. Also can be concentrated a little bit more, and when we pee it out, we can pee it out with a little bit less water, so we can preserve our water. We land animals that don't live within the water. We need to actually seek out water to survive. And then if you're a bird and you want to fly, you don't want to be carrying around a big bag of water. So you need to concentrate your urine even further, okay, beyond this struggle between getting dehydrated and not. For them, it's a question of weight. And so they can produce a waste product called uric acid, which you can see is even more complicated and takes even more energy to produce, but it's like a white paste. If you've ever had that bird poo experience, we've all been there. You know that white paste coming out of a bird, okay, is pretty much dry, only a tiny bit of water in there. We call that uric acid. So one of the most important organ systems in all of our bodies is our kidneys and the excretory system in order to maintain our water balance. And so there's the system. You have two kidneys which are constantly filtering your blood, and this is to remove some wastes, like urea, for example, and other metabolic wastes. It's going to help you to adjust your pH levels. And for our purposes talking about it today, it is your biggest player in maintaining your water balance. You can either produce concentrated or dilute urine using this organ and a couple of simple hormones. And so once your kidneys have filtered out that urine, it makes its way to the bladder where you can store it temporarily, and then out through the urethra we can pee it out. Okay, so let's have a look at the organ. Here's a nice complicated looking drawing of the kidney, and let's try to simplify some of this complexity. When you cut inside of the kidney, there's a few things going on. Here you have incoming blood through the renal artery. Here you have outgoing filtered blood through the renal vein. And you can see that those blood vessels are making their way up to this region right here. This outer layer of the kidney is called the cortex. And this is where we dump a huge portion of the blood into a separate tube that's not visible in this picture here, but is visible right here. Here's the cortex. Here's some little tiny incoming blood vessels, and then there's another separate tube. This is called the nephron, and you have about 1 million nephrons per kidney. And those nephrons are where you're going to be taking stuff out of the blood, okay, reabsorbing the stuff that you want to go back into the blood, and whatever's left over and isn't reabsorbed is going to stay in that nephron, and that's what we call urine. And you can see that's all going to collect. It's going to go through this internal region here, and it's going to eventually collect in this region right here, which are the calyces that eventually turn into what's called the renal pelvis. And if you follow that, that turns into the ureter, which is heading off to the bladder and ultimately to the urethra and out of your body. And so this internal region here is where you have the most control over your water balance. This region is called the medulla. Outer part is called the cortex. Inner part is called the medulla. This is mostly for the reabsorption of nutrients back into the blood, and this is mostly for that final adjustment of whether your urine is going to be concentrated or dilute in response to your level of hydration. So here's a really simplified diagram of what one single nephron might look like. All of these cut off edges here would each be connected to yet another nephron, and they're all draining into these collecting ducts heading out of the body through the bladder and then the urethra. And so this is the beautiful part about this system, is that it doesn't filter by removing the stuff that's bad from your body. The way that your kidneys work is that they only reabsorb what's good. And in this way, we omnivores that are eating whatever we find, if we eat something that happens to have some toxicity to it, we don't need to recognize those toxic molecules and pull them out of the blood. If they exit the blood vessel into the nephron, we're just not going to reabsorb them, and they'll head out in our pee. This is the nature of things like drug testing in sports, where even brand new drugs that have never existed before are showing up in people's pee because it gets filtered out. So there's 3 main steps. A huge fraction of your blood just comes out and goes into the nephron, and that's got all the good stuff and the bad stuff mixed in. We call that filtration. Then the job of the nephron is to reabsorb all the stuff that ought to be there. we can use some energy to actively transport some bad stuff that we recognize that are typical waste products, like urea, and we can do this with things like protons to maintain your pH balance, but we can secrete stuff into your urine as well. We do a little bit of that in the kidney too. But it's just those 3 steps, filtration, absorption, and a little bit of secretion. And so the key there is whatever you don't reabsorb ends up in the pee. Okay, so let's look at this diagram now that's showing a little bit more complexity when we zoom in on these nephrons. And here this diagram is showing you 2 nephrons, one without the blood vessels connected and one with the actual blood vessels. And you can see that when there are blood vessels all around it, it's a little bit harder to see the nephron and to really follow what's going on. But here's our incoming blood through the renal artery. And here you can see it's branching off to interface with the nephron. And in this little bubble here, which they've zoomed in on it right here, we call it the glomerulus. Okay, it goes into what's called Bowman's capsule. And so Bowman's capsule, the purple part, is the first part of the nephron, and the glomerulus is just like, think of it like a sieve of your blood vessel. The blood vessel goes in nice and solid and strong, filled with blood, and then it becomes quite porous, and a lot of the blood plasma comes rushing out due to the pressure of the blood coming in. And when it comes out of the blood vessel, it now is being forced into the nephron. So this has the good, bad, and the ugly, everything. A whole huge fraction of your blood goes in. But the blood vessel doesn't end there. It comes back out, and as you can see here, when it comes back out, it's going to start to interface with and surround the nephron itself. That's for the reabsorption piece. Okay, so here you can see the glomerulus inside of Bowman's capsule. You can imagine that there's a lot of material coming out, filled with the good, bad, and the ugly, all here in this tube called the proximal tubule. And what we're going to start doing there is we're going to reabsorb the good. Then it's going to dip down, and this is, by the way, all in the cortex. Okay, that's what this dotted line is dividing. It's the cortex from the medulla. Then the nephron is going to dip down and create this little loop. We call this the loop of Henle. And the purpose of this loop is to essentially actively pump salts out of here to create a high solute concentration in the medulla. And that is going to give us the opportunity, if we choose to use that concentration gradient, to draw extra water out of the urine if we are dehydrated. Okay, we need to create a region that can absorb water out of the pee if we need to keep it in our body. So this just sort of sets the stage. It comes back into the cortex for some final adjustments, and then this guy right here, the collecting duct, is where your urine is. And you can see it goes back into the medulla, where we have that one final chance to adjust your water balance. Okay, are we going to let all that water flow out with your pee if you're well hydrated, or are we going to change the permeability of this duct and allow water, okay, to come out of your pee and back into the medulla and ultimately back into your blood? So in the cortex, it's the place of the most amount of reabsorption. By the end of the proximal tubule, you've taken back 65% of the water that came out of your blood. You've taken back all of the glucose, all of the amino acids, and you've reabsorbed most of your important ions. Okay, all the good stuff you recognize in the proximal tubule and take it back. You also have a little bit of secretion power in this region in both the proximal and the distal tubule, where you can adjust things like your pH by playing with your H+ and carbonic acid levels. But for the most part, I think of the cortex as just reabsorbing the good. When we dip down here into the medulla, what we're doing is reabsorbing even more of these ions, this time using energy. And a lot of them are now in this region here, the medulla. We create sort of a salty zone. We allow for that concentration gradient to build. And when the collecting duct comes back, this is when we can change its permeability to water and use that concentration gradient to concentrate the urine if we need to. So here's a nice little diagram that I encourage you to have a look at that kind of breaks down each of those main regions of the nephron and tells you exactly what sorts of things are being reabsorbed and what sorts of things are being secreted and how much. And some of them it says variable because you are responding to your homeostatic needs. Okay, you can If you have too much of a waste product, pump it out. If you have not enough of a nutrient, you can suck it back in using a bit of ATP, some energy. But the main things to look at here are this collecting duct is going to be interacting with this guy right here, ADH. This is our first look at a hormone being used to regulate homeostasis. Let's look at what ADH is actually doing. So this is called the anti-diuretic hormone. And maybe this is a bit of a more gruesome image for you, but when I think of diuretic, I think of diarrhea, which we know is very watery poo. And so when we're passing lots of water, that is the effects of a diuretic. Something diuretic causes us to produce dilute urine, okay? Lots of water. And so why would we ever do that? Well, if we are very well hydrated, then there is no need to store concentrated urine in our body. We can let that water pass, and we can heavily dilute those waste products of our urine while we're storing it, okay? Not a big deal. Okay, but if we're dehydrated, we are going to want to produce the anti-diuretic hormone so that we don't waste all of that water. And this little guy right here is representing the pituitary gland in your brain. That's where the ADH is stored. And so what's happening is that your blood is constantly going into your brain, and your hypothalamus is monitoring its concentration. And if you start to get dehydrated, okay, you've got a high solute content in your blood, then your pituitary gland is going to say, release the ADH, which is going to go into your bloodstream and is going to act directly on the permeability of the collecting ducts. Okay, it's also going to tell you that you should probably go get a drink and rehydrate yourself in the meantime. So it's sort of this dual response. Stop peeing out your water and go get some more. Okay, this is the key that we want to look at. When ADH goes to your kidneys, the collecting ducts are going to bind to it, a particular protein called porin, which is going to open up and suddenly make the collecting duct permeable to water. It's one of the only membranes that is actually totally impermeable to the water without that porin. And if they open up, the surrounding medulla is salty, and out comes the water. You can concentrate the urine, and it'll get darker and darker yellow color and smellier and smellier. And you only produce that dark and smelly urine when you are dehydrated, and therefore you're producing the antidiuretic hormone. And so here you can see those two scenarios animated a little more clearly with some numbers attached. These numbers represent the osmolarity of your urine, which is just a fancy way of saying what's the concentration of it. So the higher the number, the more concentrated the solutes in the pee. And so here you can see in the loop of Henle, super concentrated. We actively pump out a bunch of those salts into the medulla region here to create that salty region. Okay, and so now you have a bit more dilute urine. And this is what could be leaving the body. Okay, but it doesn't, because you're dehydrated and ADH is present and it's opened up porin and water can start coming out. And so we start having water go, and it gets more and more and more and more concentrated until ultimately it can be isotonic with the deepest parts of the medulla. Okay, it can be up to concentrated this much. Now, depending on how much ADH we make, it can be anywhere in between. If you're well hydrated, you do not produce ADH, which makes the collecting ducts completely impermeable. And so by the time they get here and we reabsorb even more water, okay, I should also say that the distal tubule is also sensitive to ADH. You can see it's increased its permeability here too, hence the difference in these two numbers. But if there's no ADH present, we're going to get to our most dilute urine. All that water is going to stay in the distal tubule and is going to stay in the collecting duct, and out comes super low concentration dilute urine. You're going to pee a lot. And so this can be really important for understanding medicine as well. One of the things that happens to people, let's say, who are in heart failure, is that their blood pressure starts to get all out of whack. And when you start to have hypertension, high blood pressure, it starts to force fluids out of your blood vessels and, let's say, into your lungs. Okay, you start to accumulate fluid in your lungs. So how can we get it out? Well, we can give you this drug called Lasix. And all it does is it binds to ADH. And when it binds to ADH, it makes it inactive. So it basically tells your body, hey, you're super hydrated. Okay, let the pee be filled with water. Do not reabsorb water in the urine. And so what you're going to do is you're actually going to start peeing out lots and lots of water. And that's going to actually concentrate the blood, which is going to draw fluid out of your lungs back into your blood, and you're going to keep on peeing it out. So you might be in the hospital if it's a really bad case on Lasix, and they'll be hooking you up to IV and constantly keeping you hydrated but flushing it out, right? Peeing, usually into a catheter if it's a really bad situation. But we have some over-the-counter versions of this as well. Here's one of them. Alcohol. Alcohol blocks ADH as well, just like the medical drug Lasix. And so one of the things that happens when you drink a lot of alcohol is that suddenly you really need to pee. And that's because the collecting ducts in your kidneys suddenly have no more ADH, and they become impermeable to water, and they produce dilute urine. And so the odd thing about drinking is that it actually dehydrates you, depending on which alcohol you've had, depending on the concentration of it. And in general, with something like with beer or with wine, we're generally going to pee out more water than we actually put in. And so one of the consequences of this can be a part of that feeling you have when you have a hangover. Part of it is the toxicity of alcohol itself, because alcohol is a poisonous compound for your body, and it has all kinds of other negative consequences. So your liver is breaking it down, working quite hard at doing that. So that's about half of the lousy feeling you get when you have a hangover. But the other half is just severe dehydration. And so some people make the mistake the next day when they have a hangover of going to their next vice, which is this. You drink a coffee, and guess what? Caffeine is not as powerful a diuretic as alcohol is, but it also will block ADH to some degree. And this one is kind of on par as well. You're not really going to get any hydration out of coffee. And I can't even look at that one. Please, if you're going to drink it, make it a high quality one and don't drink too much of it, because we dose ourselves with this for the benefits of caffeine, which is that sort of waking us up. But of course, there's so many long-term consequences to the addictive properties of caffeine. And one of those consequences, of course, is that when you're thirsty, this is not going to quench that thirst. Okay, and think of all of the caffeinated beverages now that are available even at the gas station and being marketed to children. Sometimes we even talk about drinking things with a high solute content or with caffeine in them to hydrate us during sports, which of course makes no sense. If you want to maximize your absorption of water into your blood because you're dehydrated, the fastest absorption and the most absorption you're going to get is if you drink absolutely pure water, which is as hypotonic to your blood and to your cells as possible. That's going to maximally absorb and keep you hydrated properly. So a really important component then of your health is to monitor your water balance. Make sure that you're drinking lots and lots of water every day. And that's going to keep your kidneys healthy, it's going to keep your water balance healthy, and it's going to keep you feeling good. A good self-check is to always look at the color of your pee. If your pee is happening fairly often, or a couple of times a day, and is more or less clear, you're generally in good shape. And of course, the color of your pee can change based on your diet, because all kinds of molecules from your diet will be coming out as well. But in general, it's a good rule of thumb to aim for a high volume of fairly clear urine. But if your urine is consistently very concentrated, a darker yellow color, and there's a smell associated with it, you're probably not drinking enough water, or you are drinking enough water but coupling it with these vices. Too much alcohol, too much caffeine, too many diuretics in your diet. So monitor that and stay healthy. And so that's all I've got for you today. And I really hope that you found that helpful and starting to get you to think about how really simple hormones can have a really big deal with these negative feedback loops in keeping you hydrated. Good luck.